Hey everyone, welcome to Be the Change. My name is Lily Mott, and today's episode is about how change comes when you follow the passions you have with the spare time you have. My guest this week is Reuben Byfield, and he is a youth activist raising awareness about knife crime and the food system in the UK. I am so glad I got to interview Reuben, and I am so excited to share our conversation with you. So without further ado, let's get started with this episode featuring Reuben Byfield.
Hi everyone, I'm Reuben. I'm 18, living in Huddersfield in West Yorkshire. And I like to say I call myself a youth activist, and it's a pretty broad term. But the areas that I kind of focus most of my work are with knife crime, especially, and the food system, which is also quite broad. But looking at, I did campaign on free school meals, on junk food marketing, that sort of thing. So I kind of got started with all of this because a mutual friend actually sadly passed away because of knife crime. So it was quite a devastating experience for the community. A lot of my friends kind of lost the hope for their futures, and seeing the impacts of austerity, cuts to public services, youth services, all the youth centres shut down. It was a bit of a negative space to be. So that was kind of the way I started, by getting involved with the local rugby club, doing some work there, and it's brought me into some great rooms, and yeah, I've carried on and partnered with I Will, partnered with Bite Back, two great organisations, and so they've managed to elevate my platform to be able to reach more people basically and spread the mission that I want, which is to create a healthier and happier generation basically for us.
I think it's really interesting that you're passionate about all of these different issues and you're doing so much work to raise awareness about each of them. How do you manage to strike a balance in raising awareness about these different issues? And also, how do you just balance your commitments in general?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I think it kind of happens over time, really, because my knowledge around the different areas, especially pertaining to knife crime, kind of started when I was about 15. So I started researching, did some research projects, looked into different academic papers, then started kind of looking at that foundation, looking at different case studies that have been applied across the country. So in Glasgow specifically is a model that I focused on, and their approach to policing and creating a public health approach to knife crime. So it's really about kind of following the passions that I have with any spare time I have, really, whether it's reading books about things, having interesting conversations like this one, just reaching out to as many people I can in the field and trying to engage with those conversations. And with managing it all, I think when you enjoy it, like it doesn't feel like it's work really. So it kind of feels like it's an escape really from the other stuff that I'm doing, whether it's college work, exam pressures. And so when, even if I've got to spare 10 minutes, I'll always try to use it productively, and it can be my escape rather than people think that I'm like suddenly burnt out from all of this stuff. But it's actually kind of the opposite, really. Like it gives me happiness and fulfillment to know that like it's a positive impact, and it's something that's really helping when you can see the impact in the community around you. So yeah.
I love that. I think that is such a great point. If you love what you're doing and you're passionate about your work, hopefully it won't feel like work. And I'm going to shift gears a little bit. You've been doing this activism work for a while, and you've worked with lots of different organizations, and you've raised awareness about different issues. I think in youth social action, we often deal with tokenism. And despite being given a seat at the table, it might be more for the purpose of optics rather than actually having power at that table. Is tokenism an issue that you've ever faced?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I think most of the time when I'm reaching out to different people, whether it be like MPs and or different people in the space, it's kind of seen as on their side. Oh, it's a great opportunity for a PR stunt. I can get a photograph with this person, with this young person, can put it on my Twitter or Instagram and say, look, I've met with a young person, rather than meaningfully engaging with the discussion. And so it's really important for me personally, to try and set those boundaries going into discussion, that I'm not just a young person. I'm a collaborator on this. And so it can be a tendency. People fall into it, they might do it accidentally to kind of be like, "Oh, you're so young. Wow, you're doing great things for an 18-year-old." Whereas, like in my headspace, I want it to be like, "Let's look at the issue together. Treat me as another fellow adult instead of using me as this like token essentially. Listen to what I'm saying, go, wow, that's super interesting, and never follow up or kind of keep going back and forth because I know all of these people are very busy, but it's also difficult to kind of find your voice as well because being in rooms where it's kind of the majority are like white old middle class men, it's very difficult to be able to uh, engage with them effectively because they kind of see you and they don't have an expectation there. And so to build the trust between them, it's really, really hard. And so it's taken like a really long time on boards and things like that to really get through to people, uh, for them to understand the messaging and to really like say, oh, I trust this guy. I know he's young, but his ideas make sense, and we're going to take a chance and listen and move forward.
I think that is a great way to put it. And I think that advice about setting your expectations and making them clear as far as what you are hoping to get out of a meeting or an event, I think that's really important. So, can you also tell me about what is next for you and where you see all of this work going in the future? I know that this is a time with lots of transitions. So, what are you excited about in the future? Maybe both the short term and also the long term.
So a big thing for me is recently I was working with the organization I have been for the past couple of years, but unfortunately the funding streams have been cut, which is unfortunate. But it's also meant it's the amazing opportunity for me to kind of go at it on my own and start fresh as a founder. And so I'm kind of in the early stages of building my own project around knife crime in Yorkshire itself. And so it's kind of establishing that in the short term and hopefully reaching out to as many young people as we can that have been affected by knife crime or even who have been worried about it. And so those are my kind of steps. So, and just kind of engaging with people, demystifying what it means to be a young person, getting into as many rooms as I can around issues to do with youth services. Youth centers is another one to really just like reach out as much as I can. I'm trying to use the people around me to try and get into these rooms, whether it be in a politician or a local charity and stuff like that. So that's kind of my goal. In terms of long term, I don't really know. And I think I'm kind of happy that I don't really know where I want to be because I think that I've got my short term goals in place and you never know who I'm going to meet along the way that can kind of change the way things look. I've got a kind of an end goal, which is to kind of improve and reduce the amount of people affected by knife crime, which is a very long term solution. But I think we'll see where the wind takes me really. And I think I don't want to create this 5, 10 year plan for myself when who knows what can happen really. I know that I kind of want to focus towards activism to some degree, whether that be in politics. I don't know about being an MP or anything like that. It seems bit too overly party political, but yeah, we'll see what happens.
I think that is a great answer, and your thoughts about politics and being a politician kind of lead perfectly into the next question that I'd like to ask you about politics in the UK. In the UK, do you think that there is a division between politics in London and politics outside of London, such as West Yorkshire, where you're from? Have you faced any challenges being involved in politics and being involved in activism as someone who is not based in London?
Yeah, no, it's a really cool question because I think the North-South divide is always a really interesting topic, and I think people don't really kind of flesh it out as a young person from their perspective. And so I think that the main thing for me is if we go way back before I even started activism, into kind of education as a whole and the approach to that. And so the amount of resources, the quality of teaching, the amount of teachers, the large classrooms, it's way bigger than it is than any of my friends who I spoke to in London. And you can see that with the performance outcomes, which are way higher. Going through high school and college, I didn't really have as many teachers who I could kind of look to as these kind of mentors or have the youth services around me, have the clubs, have the different opportunities to pursue any passion of mine. I fell into athletics and I really enjoyed it, but there are loads of other things that young people want to experience that they couldn't if they were living in London, maybe they could. And I think that was really important, especially with opportunities, because I think there's a massive inequity between the distribution. Because as I've grown up and I've realized there are so many opportunities out there for every single field of work, just having conversations with people, you realize, wow, you can do X, Y, Z. But when I was until like a year ago, I was stuck in my little bubble in West Yorkshire, and I had no idea about any of these sorts of things. And so I feel like the networks, the places that you can kind of get into are very restricted. And I think especially when you've got the corridors of power, everything so centralized around Westminster, it's very difficult to kind of make influence, especially as a young person. I don't have the budget to travel down to London to go and meet all of these people, and so it's really difficult. I know we have Zoom and everything like that, but it's a very different scenario when most of these meetings and conversations are happening in person with everyone around the table or in these offices. And so I think when you have the resources, it's very difficult from that perspective. And so when you're trying to start these organizations or get your voice heard, it's mainly the London-based voices, uh, and kind of the experiences of people living in the South. You can kind of feel like you're very in your own bubble, being like, oh, you don't really think about what's going on in the North or kind of how life is different or if it is different in any way. When in actuality, it's extremely different, and it's kind of my lived experience has kind of proven that, and the challenges that we face are very different.
Thank you so much for explaining all of that. I think that's really interesting. And I have one more question for you. Lots of young people want to create change, but they may not know how to get started. What advice do you have for those people who may be listening?
I think the biggest thing for me is conversations, because it's very easy, and I fell into this trap recently into overthinking everything and just keeping everything up here and not really fleshing out or thinking that you can actually make these ambitions a reality, whether that be starting your own project or doing that thing, talking to that person, going outside of your comfort zone. And so I think when you're talking to people, even if it's your friend, you can actually kind of see that idea develop and have those people around you that may not have direct experience of what you're on about, but they can add in and say, oh, we thought about this. I know this person. And so you can kind of build those support system around you to really get started, because it's a very lonely process when you're trying to start something new or you're trying to overcome adversity in your community, because it can feel like I only have these experiences and it's very difficult to have that connection unless you actually talk about it. And so I think that's the main thing, is to just keep on talking, and eventually that's how movements happen, right? It's these conversations that spread, and your friend might tell another friend who might be interested, and those, it can all kind of spiral and go from there to build something great. And that's how it could possibly happen.
I think the work that Reuben is doing is so important, and he is so passionate about making change. Reuben shared so many great pieces of advice throughout our conversation, and I had a hard time choosing which one to highlight at the end of this episode. I landed on his advice about following your passions with the spare time you have, because I think it is such a great way to get started making change. Everyone is passionate about something, so figure out what that is, and even if you don't have much of it, use the extra time in your day to pursue it. I think this advice can be applied to sports, music, other hobbies, or social action, and Reuben is a great example of how change comes when you follow the passions you have with the spare time you have. Thank you so much for listening to this episode, and you can find Reuben on Instagram and LinkedIn, and I've included those links in the description of this episode. If you want to talk about anything I mentioned, please reach out to me by email at lily@bethechangepodcast.org or on Instagram at Be The Change Media Network. I am working on expanding Be The Change Media Network, which means bringing you more inspiring stories from amazing guests. If you enjoyed this episode, I would really appreciate it if you could leave the podcast a rating and a comment, because it will help these stories to reach, educate, and inspire more people. And I would also love to hear your thoughts and feedback. Tune in for my next episode, but until then, be the change you wish to see in the world. Bye, guys.